Good evening, folks. Hey. All right. Thank you. Totally wonderful. Thanks. All right. My name is Mary Ann, and I'm the executive director here at the Fine Arts Center. And I am very, very pleased to be on the stage this evening that Dorothy has asked me to introduce this program. And I want to thank all of you for coming this evening. I think it's important to support the arts and to support the spoken word and storytelling as an art. It is something that is so important to our culture and so important to the future. Thank you all for supporting this event tonight. And also to Dottie Jean for throwing her hat over the fence and stepping up and doing this program tonight. She's worked very, very hard, and I know you are in for a treat. So, first out on the stage this evening will be Dottie Jean. So Dorothy Kirk, or Dottie Jean as she is known in the storytelling world, has lived in Tryon since 1993. Dottie Jean has been a storyteller most of her life, but started pursuing it seriously when she retired in 2011. Dottie Jean tells personal stories of growing up in the Chestnut Hill neighborhood of Salisbury, North Carolina. Y'all have fun. Oh. Wow, thank you. Thank you all for being here. I echo what Mary Ann said, and it's a delight to see you all here. Thank you. I grew up surrounded by stories. They swirled around me like leaves would swirl in the air on a windy fall day. But being a little girl, I never got the whole story. There were parts of the stories, many parts of the story that the adults wanted to keep from me. They didn't consider they were things that I should know. And I could always tell when those parts came. They would either make some gestures about things. They would go like this, and they would speak in code. For example, if a woman was having problems with her period, they wouldn't say that. They'd say, she's having female problems. If she was pregnant, they would say, she's PG. I never actually heard the word pregnant spoken out loud until I was 14 years old. Now, they happily told me the stories they wanted me to hear. And they told these over and over again. The bedtime stories you hear, you know how they're going to turn out. I found them boring. I wanted to hear the secret stories, the hidden stories, the things they didn't want to tell me or didn't want me to know. So there was only one thing left for me to do. Out of necessity, I became a story sleuth. And to be a good story sleuth requires very special skills. First, I had to be invisible. And this meant being out of the range of the conversation, but not so far out of the range that I couldn't hear what they were saying or sense what was going on. I need to make sure that they didn't notice me. So this meant I had to pretend to be engaged and involved in some activity. So I'd play with my dolls or puzzles, or I learned that the best thing to do for me was to sit quietly in a chair with my nose in a book. And they would forget I was there, and that would be the best thing. So in my development as a story sleuth, I became a professional eavesdropper and developed some incredible observation skills. I'm going to tell you some stories tonight that are stories that I have sleuthed out. Sleuth can be a verb. I sleuthed out these stories. And a couple of these stories took a lifetime of sleuthing. Practically my entire life to figure out, put the pieces together to the story, to find the bits and pieces, the evidence, the memorabilia that would help put it together. All the stories are love stories tonight.
that I'm telling. A few years ago, I told one of these stories, a love story, and another storyteller said, I find that we tell the stories we really need to have in our lives. Well, I need love stories in my life, and I think everybody does, so I'm telling love stories tonight. Two of the stories, all these stories, I'm telling you 3 stories, they would not exist, as stories, without my sleuthing. These stories are alive today, and I am able to tell them to you because of the story sleuths. One of the stories, I'll admit, I was kind of a failure as a story sleuth. I knew there was a story. I couldn't quite get at it, but it unfolded in the perfect way without any help from me. I first got interested in story sleuthing when it was 1951. I was 8 years old and just out of the 2nd grade. The reason I got interested in story sleuthing as a serious pursuit is because of my babysitter, Mrs. Leela Butcher. My brother and I called her Mrs. Butcher, sometimes Butcher for short. She lived just the house down from us. She was the age of my grandmother, really. And I knew that Leela Butcher had a story, but I didn't know what it was. And I really wanted to find out what is her story. One thing that I observed about her that made me think she had a story worth hearing is that she never told any stories. You know, my mother told stories, my aunts told stories, everybody around me told stories. She never told me any stories, and she never really talked very much about herself. So I thought, well, that piqued my interest, and I thought there is something there that is worth hearing. So I would ask questions and try to find out, but without much luck. I knew she had been married and that her husband's name was Don. And I knew that he was somewhere far away and they could not be together, but I had no idea why. No one would say. He was just away somewhere. I couldn't quite figure out why she was married to Don and they weren't living together. I remember one time she was in our kitchen that summer of 1951, writing on a ruled tablet, sitting at the kitchen table. And I went up to her and I said, "Are you writing a letter to Don?" She paused a moment and said, not in a sad way, but just as though, "Oh, you poor child, no way you can understand." She said, No, I'm not writing to Don." Somehow I knew from that just not to ask any more questions. I didn't ask any more questions, so I had to find other methods to sleuth out her story. And what I turned to was, in our backyard, we had a very tall and strong black walnut tree. And I could climb that tree, and I would climb to the top of the tree, or almost to the top of the tree, where there'd be 2 strong branches that formed a V. And I could sort of rest in that V and nestle there, so to speak. And from that point, I could see basically my world at that point. My neighborhood, the Chestnut Hill neighborhood of Salisbury. I could see the houses. I could see all the houses. I could even, if it was, the best time for me to climb that tree was at dusk, or sometimes it was dusk, was when Mama came home from work, because Butcher was our babysitter, and Butcher would walk the back path from her back door to our back door, a distance of about 60 feet. And we always took the back way. We called it the back way. Take the back way. Go down to Butcher's and borrow 2 eggs and take the back way. So she would walk the 60 feet the back way home, and Mom would be busy fixing dinner, so I could climb that tree then. The reason is, if either Mama or Miss Butcher knew I was climbing that tree, they would get upset with me, especially Mrs. Butcher. The one time she caught me climbing that tree up at the top, she yelled up, "Dottie Jean, get out of that tree. Don't you know you're going to fall, break your neck, and die?" I didn't pay much mind to that because Miss Butcher thought everything I wanted to do that was fun would cause me to die. I have whole stories about her risk management to make sure I didn't die. But in fact, I used to teach project management, and I taught project management using some of her lessons. But anyway, risk management. She even told me one time that drinking too much water would kill me. She said I should limit my water intake to a half a glass of water a day. So I learned kind of not to pay attention to those things that she thought would kill me. So I would get up into the top of that black walnut tree, and I could see my world, and I could see the lights. If it was dusk, like often it would be, Mama came home from work, Butcher went home. It seemed like magic. The lights in all the houses would come on, and I could see the street lights come on and everything. And when I climbed that black walnut tree, I always took my spyglass with me. I ordered a bunch of sleuthing tools from the back of a comic book. I ordered a spyglass, a periscope, which was perfectly useless, and a magnifying glass. So I would take that up, and if I could look into Miss Butcher's kitchen, and I could see her getting supper on the table. I could see she and her sister Louise sitting down to eat dinner. They both had been married, but neither were living with husbands at the time and didn't have any children, so they lived together in the family home. Their mother had lived there previously, but she had died, so they lived on there. And I could see Miss Butcher clearing the table and washing the dishes. And when she washed the dishes, she always had a kettle of simmering hot water on the stove for things like washing the dishes, because in 1951, Miss Butcher didn't have hot water in her house. She had running water, she had an indoor toilet, of course, and she even had a bathtub, perfectly unusable, unless you want to take a cold bath, but she had no hot water. And that was, even in 1951, that was unusual. That was the only house I knew that did not have hot water. So she had to boil water for dishes and everything. If I focused my spyglass real careful, I could even read the writing on a wall plaque she had hanging in her kitchen that later hung in my own kitchen, and I still have today. It was a round plaque, and it had a picture of a Pennsylvania Dutch couple. You could tell by their outfits. And they were leaning forward toward each other with their lips just about to meet, but not quite meeting. And written underneath in sampler style, cross-stitch style, was one of Mrs. Butcher's favorite words of wisdom to me. "Kissin' don't last, cookin' do." Mrs. Butcher was a great cook. She was a legendary cook, in fact. People still talk. I have a cousin that still talks about her chow chow, how much he wished she could have some Miss Butcher's chow chow. But she cooking was in her mythology. Everybody has stories they tell about themselves. And she said that when she was 6 years old, her mother got sick one day, and Miss Butcher was the oldest child. They had to get lunch on the table, and biscuits had to be made, and Miss Butcher made those biscuits. She had to pull a stool over to the counter so she could stand up and make the biscuits, but she made the biscuits. And from that moment on, she couldn't be stopped when it came to cooking, nor could she be topped. When Miss Butcher started teaching me to cook, which she did, she was full of those little words of wisdom like "cooking don't last, cooking do." Another one that she told me many times was, "The way to a man's heart is through his stomach." And if she got frustrated with me and I wasn't taking enough interest in cooking, she would say, "Dottie Jean, you won't be worth a hill of beans if you don't learn how to cook." Now, Butcher and Louise were not blood relatives of ours, not blood kin, but they might as well have been. They were really part of our family. The main reason is that my mother, her own mother, had died when she was 10 years old. And she was always looking for a mother figure, a surrogate mother. She always looked to older women. And Mrs. Butcher, born in 1896, was about the age my mother's mother would be. And Miss Butcher had always wanted a daughter. She didn't have any children. So they met each other's needs and became very close, like mother and daughter. So we were very much like family, with all the things that happen in families. Families, there's a lot of sharing. There was a lot of sharing between us and Butcher and Louise. That back path, we kept that back path hot with taking things from one place to the other. Mama would borrow from Butcher. Butcher would borrow from us. If they needed something, we would let them have it. If we needed something, we'd go get it, back and forth. But it was a lot more than things that we shared. For example, Butcher and Louise never owned a car, and neither one of them ever drove. So if they had to go somewhere, they took a bus or walked. But if they couldn't do that, Mama would take them or Daddy would take them. And when I became 16 years old and got my driver's license, that job fell to me. Every Saturday afternoon after I got my driver's license, my job was to take Butcher and Louise from grocery store to grocery store to grocery store. Food Lion to Winn-Dixie to A&P, so that they could take advantage of all the savings that they had been offered in the coupons that they clipped out of the Thursday afternoon paper. So it was that kind of, it was very, very much like family that way. The other thing that you do with your family, you learn in your with your family. And I learned so much from Miss Butcher, not only learning to cook, but I learned a lot of other life lessons as well. For example, when I was a freshman in high school, I had to take home ec. All the girls had to take home ec then. That was 1957. Now, cooking was no problem. She taught me how to cook, but sewing was a problem. I had never, Mama didn't sew. We didn't have a sewing machine. I didn't know anything about sewing. So we're going to have to do a sewing project. So Mama took me down to Belk's. We bought a shorty pajama pattern, simplicity pattern, and then bought all the fabric and buttons and everything else that I would need for the class. And I took it to the class, expecting that the teacher would teach us how to sew. Well, she didn't. This was her first job, first right out of college. All she wanted to do was talk about her boyfriend, her fiance, and what they had done over the weekend and planning for their wedding and everything. We were sitting there trying to, with lab tables, cut out tables and things. She never walked around and asked us or anything. I had to try to figure out how to make these shorty pajamas. I knew nothing. I didn't know what the selvage was. I didn't know about straightening the fabric, laying out the pattern and cut it. I knew none of those things. The only way I got through that part of it is that I quietly observed what all the other girls were doing, and I just kind of followed suit. And sometimes good observation skills are necessary to survival, and in that case, they paid off for me. But I could only get as far as cutting out the pattern because the rest of it required using the sewing machine. I'd never used a sewing machine, didn't know how to use it. Threading the needle, winding the bobbin, completely foreign to me. And I was two-ish. She didn't come around and check or ask, and all the other girls seemed to have been born with a sewing gene and knowing how to sew. And they were just going to town on their projects, and I was just struggling with my little pieces of material trying to figure out what to do. Finally, it was the day before projects were to be turned in. All the other girls were putting the finishing touches on theirs, ironing them, making them look nice and everything. All I had to show was a little bag of fabric pieces. And I thought, well, the handwriting is on the wall. I am going to flunk home ec. A completely unheard of thing. That night I took my little sack of fabric pieces home and I walked that back way to Miss Butcher's house. You see, Miss Butcher was an expert seamstress too. She was the queen of all things domestic, let me just say that. And she would sew all her clothes. I think she even made the patterns. And not only clothes, and some of you will not know that we actually did these things back then, but Miss Butcher made skirts for every piece of furniture in her house. She had vanity skirts around dressing tables. She had skirts around her kitchen sink so that you couldn't see cleaning products back there. She made bed skirts, everything. She was into furniture skirts. So I went down the back path with my little bag of fabric, just intending to ask her if she would please teach me to use her sewing machine so I could get this sewed up for class the next day. It was one of those treadle machines that she worked with her foot. So I went in their back door and I told her what I needed. She said, well, I tell you what, she said, I have a letter to write, a business letter, and it has to be perfect. And it needs to be typed and professional looking. And you're really good at English grammar and spelling and all that, and you've learned how to type and you got a typewriter. I tell you what, if you let me dictate to you what I want said in this letter, and you take it back and write it, make it perfect, get it typed up, bring it back to me, then I'll finish these pajamas for you. She said, and I'll make it look like you finished them. She said, I'll make a few mistakes and I'll sew the seams crooked. Well, boy, that was a deal for me. She didn't have to ask twice. So I went back home and composed her letter. I checked it several times. I got Daddy's old Royal portable typewriter out and typed it up, double-checked it, the envelope. And I went back and took it, and she had my pajamas finished. I took it in the next day. I did not fail. I did get a catty remark from the teacher, sort of along the lines of, oh, Dottie Jean, I never thought you'd finish those pajamas. But I learned a lot from her, but it wasn't about sewing. I learned that the world is a giant exchange, a network of reciprocity, and that I actually might have something to offer that exchange. I didn't know how to sew, but I was good at English grammar. The hardest personal lesson, spiritual lesson I ever learned, I learned from Miss Butcher. I was just 4 years old, and Miss Butcher had just become our babysitter. My brother was 6 months old. Mama was going to go back to work, and she asked Miss Butcher if she'd babysit for us, and she said yes. So one day I was with my aunt, my mother's sister, Virgie, and Virgie said, oh, Dottie Jean, I know you just love having Miss Butcher as a babysitter, don't you? She is such a lovely lady. Your mama is so lucky she got Miss Butcher to babysit for y'all. I know you just love her. I said, no, I don't. Miss Butcher locked me in the closet yesterday, and they made me stay there all afternoon. And I don't like her at all. And my aunt said, oh, Dottie Jean, you don't mean that. She didn't really lock you in the closet, did she? I said, yes, she did. I had a dark closet. I had to stay there all day. I was telling an outrageous lie. I don't even know why I was telling that lie. It was just something that popped into my head. I mean, I was just making up something. I was enjoying seeing my aunt's reaction. But Miss Butcher hadn't locked me in the closet. She had never even as much as switched me, which is what we used to call disciplining and things. But I didn't even think about it. It just popped out. And so nothing else was said about it. I assumed that was the end of the story. And so the next day I was at home, and Mama and my Aunt Virgie come in the door. They'd been down visiting Miss Butcher. Now that in itself wasn't uncommon. But they would look very serious, and they came in and said, Dottie Jean, we need to talk to you, and we want you to promise us that you'll tell us the truth. I was beginning to get a little nervous, didn't know what this was about. They said, we've just been visiting with Miss Butcher, and we left her down there crying her eyes out. We just had to find out whether she had really locked you in the closet or not. We asked her about it, and she said, no, she didn't lock you in the closet, and she'd never do such a thing. She got so upset, she was crying. She said she was so hurt that I would tell such a story on her. By the way, they never said I lied. They said, don't tell a story on somebody. You told a story. I had told a big story on Miss Butcher. And she said, they said, and she doesn't think she can ever come back again and babysit for y'all after what has happened, after you have told this big story on her. Oh, she said, they said, now tell us the truth. Did she lock you in that closet? Oh, I was so scared. I had to tell the truth. I said, no, she didn't lock me in the closet. I don't know why I said that. I just told a story. And they said, well, thank you for telling us, and there's only one thing that can be done to set this right. You are going to have to go to Miss Butcher and beg her forgiveness. And those are the words she used. You're going to have to beg her for her to forgive you. And so the three of us went walking to Miss Butcher's house. This time we walked the front way, the sidewalk way. It was a little more formal situation. And I was really scared. I didn't even really know how to say those words. And so we walked into Miss Butcher's house, and I could tell she had been crying. She had been crying. She was still sniffling and everything. And I said, "Oh, Miss Butcher, I am so sorry. I told a story on you, and I didn't mean to. I beg you to forgive me." And she did. She forgave me. And she said she did forgive me, and things eased off a little bit. And she got up and got us some iced tea and some cookies, and things got all right. Had been really worried about what kind of punishment would follow that, but there was none. Mama said she felt I had learned my lesson, and I had learned my lesson. And Miss Butcher did come back to babysit for us, and she was our babysitter for the next 11 years. But during that 11-year period, I never found out any information about her and Don. I didn't know where he was. I didn't know what had happened or anything. It was only in 1976 when Miss Butcher died, and I was talking to my mother. I said, well, because Miss Butcher's obituary did refer to her as Mrs. Leela Butcher, but it didn't mention anything about being married to Don. It didn't mention anything about maybe he had predeceased her. Nothing, not a word about him. So I asked Mama about it. She said, well, Mrs. Butcher and Don had gotten married when she was about 16 or 17 years old. She was born in 1896, mind you, so that would have been 1912, 13. Think of this. I'm telling you a story about somebody in my life who was born in 1896 and would have gotten married in 1912, over 100 years ago. And that Butcher had told them that they loved each other very much. They were very compatible. Don, like she did, loved working in the yard and loved gardening, and that they were happy. And then World War I came. And Don either joined the Army or was drafted, I don't know, but joined up with the Army. And this was when the United States entered World War I in April of 1917. And he was shipped to France, where he was a member of the infantry, carrying a rifle, living in the trenches, fighting on the Western Front. And that he fought there for, 2 years or so, till the war was over. And when he came back home, there wasn't much of Don left. He was a damaged man, suffering from shell shock. He had been wounded in addition. And he couldn't return to his home and his wife. They sent him to a soldier's home in Indiana. I think then a soldier's home would be like a veterans hospital today. Mama said that Mrs. Butcher followed him to Indiana and rented a room in a private home, believing that her presence, she would help him recover. She could have, he would begin to recognize her. He would get better. And she stayed there a few months, and he never got any better. He never knew she was there. And the doctors told her there was very little chance he'd ever be able to return home or lead a normal life. Mrs. Butcher's mother begged her to come back home, arguing that she had no friends there. She didn't have a support system. She had family in Salisbury. Would she please come back home? So reluctantly, Miss Butcher came back home, got on the train and came home. At that point, Mama said she didn't know whether Don was living or dead. They did not know. Miss Butcher never divorced him. She never remarried. But World War I essentially ended their marriage as she knew it. Then after the last piece, the story wasn't yet complete. The last piece of the puzzle came after my own mother died in 1987. And Mama had been Miss Butcher's heir. So I had a collection of Mama's memorabilia, photographs and everything. And in that was some of Mrs. Butcher's things. So I found a little 2x3 light cardboard thing that looked like a picture frame that you could open up that way. And I opened it up, and inside was a picture of Don, because it said that, and a newspaper article from 1920. And it was about Don. It said Don Ritchie, who was a resident of Lafayette Soldiers' Home somewhere in Indiana, had been awarded the Purple Heart for being wounded at the Battle of Cantigny, And he had also been awarded the Silver Cross for conspicuous gallantry in battle. He had fought in some of the most horrific battles of the Western Front. And he came home a hero, a war hero, but he didn't know it. Not only that, Miss Butcher never talked about it. She never bragged about him. She never shared his heroism. The only answer I can have for that is just she thought if he'd been less of a hero, maybe he would have been able to come home to her, because we never knew that of him. His heroism was hidden in that box of memorabilia and photographs, unknown to us. And it was then that I realized that all that sleuthing I did, that I had the story all along. I had the essential clue to Miss Butcher's life. And it was in that wall plaque that I used to look at through my spyglass, in which she gave me when I had my first house. And it's for Mrs. Butcher. The kissing didn't last, but the cooking lasted a lifetime. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Before Mrs. Butcher was my babysitter, and I was maybe before my brother was born even, and my mother wasn't working, but she needed to go run some errands and do some things, she would take me to Daddy's office, my father's office, and leave me there with him for a while she went to the doctor or did a few things that she had to do. And I didn't mind that a bit. I loved going to Daddy's office. It was, it was an exciting thing to sit outside the window of Daddy's office and look. It expanded my world. It opened up the world for me. Gave me a whole nother area to practice my story sleuthing skills on. You see, my father's business was Kirk's Taxi in Salisbury, North Carolina. He and his brother, Arnold Jr., both worked for their father, joined their father's business. It was a business their father had started in 1914. He started a taxi company. The office to the taxi company was directly across the street from the Salisbury train depot. That building is a beautiful building. It's a Spanish mission-style architecture building. People still come from all over to take pictures of that building. But that was to sit outside of Daddy's office right directly across the train station was the most exciting thing for me when I was 4 years old. Because at the height of passenger train service in the United States, 44 trains a day went through Salisbury. That's kind of hard to believe. That's like being in Grand Central Station. It was mainly the Southern Railway. Most of their trains would stop in Salisbury, the Crescent and other trains. So I would sit out on that bench and just, I could hear the trains coming from a distance. I could hear that train whistle. I could see the smoke. Then I could hear the chugging and the chugging as the train approached the platform. Finally, you would reach the platform and just sort of shudder and give off a lot of steam and stop. And at that point, passengers would flow across the street to get a taxi. There weren't people there with cars to pick them up for the most part. They needed taxis. So there'd be drivers waiting there with the passenger door open, waiting for people to get in, and they would take them somewhere. Sometimes all the taxis would be taken and the people would have to wait on the bench for me. And that was always exciting. There would be women dressed up, people dressed up in hat and gloves, heels, suits. There were soldiers then. It was 1947, still a lot of soldiers. Businessmen in business suits with leather cases and the whole thing. They would sit on the bench with me and talk. I tried to gather what I could about their stories, but they usually weren't there long enough. They were just kind of ephemeral stories. But this was so exciting for me to be able to do that. When we were between trains, I would often just drift over to the garage. The garage is where all the taxi maintenance took place. My uncle, Arnold Jr., who was my father's younger brother, just 18 months younger, was in charge of maintaining all the taxi cabs. And at the height of the business then, they had as much as 20 taxi cabs. And it was a 24/7 business. There was always a dispatcher on duty 24/7, and all night long, there were some drivers that were always there. It was always open, and the cars were always working, and they got a lot of wear and tear. The drivers weren't particularly always careful with those cars. So my uncle was kept busy doing all kinds of, he did routine maintenance, he did repairs, he rebuilt engines, he even repaired upholstery, did some minor body work, but that was his main job. And he loved that job because he had been an airline mechanic in the war. Daddy and Arnold Jr. had both been in service during the war. When they came back, they joined their daddy's business, and he made them co-owners. My own father, who had no skills at all in fixing anything, he was more geared toward accounting and business, so he did all that kind of thing. And Arnold Jr. had been an airline mechanic, so he did that. So sometimes I would drift over to that garage to see Arnold Jr. Sometimes all I would see were his legs sticking out from under a car that he was working on. If he knew I was standing there, he'd come rolling out and say something to me. So, but I would walk over there to the garage, and I'd get to that garage door, and I would stop, and I wouldn't go in. Main reason, it was the smell. It was that smell of paint and oil and rubber, and it made me feel a little queasy. And it always seemed dirty and dark, so I'd stop just short of the door. But I never stayed long because I had to rush back to the bench and meet the next train. And the business continued. It had been a success for a long time until finally in the late 1960s, the taxi business began to fail. I was away. I had already graduated college at this point, but there were several reasons for that. You know, everybody got a car. You know, a lot of families had no car, now they had 2 or 3 cars. People didn't ride trains anymore. In fact, passenger train service, Amtrak in 1970 took over passenger rail service and was always threatening to go bankrupt in those early days. And so businesses that depended on train services, my father's business did to a large degree, just were suffering. In fact, right up the street from my father's business was the Yadkin Hotel, which was another center of activity. A lot of people would get off the train, go stay at the Yadkin Hotel. The Yadkin Hotel closed in like 1973 or 74. Even our train depot that had been so busy, it closed. And if anybody was foolish enough to want a train, they had to go to some outpost out somewhere at some stop where you could get on the train. It didn't stop at the depot. But Daddy's business was going to close in 1977. They'd hung on as long as they could. He and his brother had already sold the property. It was going to be developed, and so everything was going to be torn down. And so they were arranging, that my father and uncle had arranged to have an auction to liquidate everything, the cars, all the tools, a big gigantic safe Daddy had. Everything was going to be auctioned off. I drove up from Atlanta because I wanted one last look at that place that had been so important in my childhood. Mama took me up there because the business had already closed. And we went into the little taxi office, which she had to unlock. I had never seen that office locked, ever, in my life, because it was a 24/7 business. It was always open. I could go there anytime, and there was always somebody there. In my memory, it had only been locked once, and it was when I was a junior in high school in 1960. And Salisbury, for several weeks in a row, had been bombarded with snow. And one Wednesday, it was a particularly heavy snow. Snow had come down and came down so fast and so heavy that nobody could get anywhere. The drivers couldn't get to the office to work. Everything came to a standstill. So for the first time ever, my father locked up the business, locked the door, and he and Mama walked home in the snow. And I remember them coming into our house, having walked about 1.5 miles from their office to our house. And they were in such a good mood. They were so happy and giggling. They'd been playing in the snow, throwing snowballs at each other and everything. So they came in the house, and they'd no more gotten their boots off and everything when they said, "Well, we're tired. We're going to go take a nap. Don't you kids disturb us." And that seemed reasonable to me. I mean, they were old people. And walking 1.5 miles was bound to have been tiring for them. So we didn't disturb them. And it was only years later, sometimes the story sleuth is a little slow. It was years later that I realized they weren't tired. They didn't sleep. They didn't nap. That was afternoon delight time. And that year, my mother had just turned 40, and my father was 43. So, anyway, so we had looked around, and it looked so shabby, this place I'd once considered the center of the world. The phones were always ringing, people in and out. And then we walked over to the garage to take a look. And Mama had to unlock that door as well and open it and go in. And I almost didn't go in because it's that same smell again, that oil and rubber and paint. But it was my last chance, so we walked in. There were some taxis in there. They were going to be auctioned off, as well as some on the lot. Tools had been put out. They were all going to be auctioned. And we walked toward the back of the garage. And there had always been a bathroom back there. But as we started walking back there, it looked like somebody put a screen up of some kind. And as we got closer and I looked, and it was set up like a little bedroom. There was a double bed there. There were 2 end tables, lamps. There was even a rug. It looked so cozy. A refrigerator had been brought in, a little refrigerator. And I looked at Mama and said, is somebody living here? Mama said, no. She said, that's what me and your daddy call Arnold Jr.'s love nest. I said, Arnold Jr.'s love nest? She said, yes. She said, nobody knows this, really. Nobody knows this, but Etta Mae was not Arnold Jr.'s first wife. You see, when he came home from the service in 47, he didn't get home until 47, he very quickly soon got married to Etta Mae, as a woman he had started dating before the war. And, when he got home, she focused all of her feminine energy on him, and in just a very short time they were married. But she said, Etta Mae wasn't his first wife. I said, oh, no? She said, no, and he was very young, just barely 18. He married Anne, and she was a beautiful girl. He was head over heels in love with her. She was so beautiful, she'd been a Coca-Cola model. You could see her image on the Coca-Cola trays and calendars. He had a big poster of her hanging up in his bedroom. He was just so much in love with her, and she loved him too. They were so much in love. But it was right before the war. He was probably certain that he was going to be drafted. They didn't have any money. Housing was scarce. And so she just moved in to his bedroom with your grandparents, because that way when he was drafted and had to go to war, she'd have a place, she'd be safe and everything. And Mama said, that he was working for my grandfather, and that sometimes he had to work at night because my own father had to work at night. Taxi drivers can be notoriously unreliable, especially with coming to the night shift. So my father would have to fill in, or my uncle would have to fill in, because the trains had to be met. So Mom said he often had to work at night like your daddy. So one night, Arnold Jr. came home and went up to his bedroom, opened the door, expecting to see Anne, but she wasn't there. So he thought, well, she's in the bathroom. So he went to the bathroom and looked for her. She wasn't there. He searched the house over. He went outside and looked. And when he came back, he looked and he noticed all of her things were gone. All of her clothes, everything she had brought with her was gone. And her wedding band had been left on the dresser. Mama said that he was so heartbroken. He was devastated. He went into a really bad depression, that's so bad that his parents thought they might have to find some place where he could rehabilitate or get better because he was so depressed. But then gradually he got over it. He began dating Etta Mae, and things seemed a little better. And then he was drafted and went off to World War II. And they knew when he left he wasn't completely over Anne, but he was dating Etta Mae, and they felt hopeful about it. I said, well, Mama, why is this a secret? Nobody knew that. She said it was the 1930s, early 40s. Nobody wanted to have divorce in their family. We didn't want to talk about it. If we ever mentioned her name, he got really upset and depressed, and we didn't want to do that. And after he married Etta Mae, it was pointless. I said, okay. I said, well, what's this got to do with the setup here? And Mama said, hold your horses. I'm going to tell you. Let me light a cigarette first. Now, this is how I knew a good story was coming. If Mama had to say, let me light a cigarette first, something really good was coming. So she lighted her cigarette. She said, it was a couple years ago now. She said, your daddy and I were working in the office, and she said, I looked out the door and I saw this car drive up and a beautiful woman get out. She was about my age, and she said, I recognized her right away. And I said to your father, I said, Raymond, you will never guess who's about to walk in the door. And at just that point, Ann walked in the door, Arnold Jr.'s first wife. And she came in and talked to Mom and Daddy. She said that after she left Arnold Jr., she met a man from Virginia, moved to Virginia, married him, and they'd had a wonderful marriage, that they had beautiful children, they'd been active in the community, they had a very rich life, and she had been very happy with him, but that he had died a year or so earlier, and that she had always felt bad about Arnold Jr., that she had left without explanation. They'd never talked. She had never got a chance to tell her side of why she did. She said, I was so young, I was too young to be married, and he was not there in the evening so often, and I was stuck there talking to my father, with your mother, and she wasn't very helpful. I felt like I was out of place. Plus, I began to doubt whether Arnold Jr. was really working. Maybe he was seeing somebody else. And then I started getting really jealous, and I decided I just had to get out. She said, I want to talk to Arnold Jr. and tell him what happened, and I want to ask his forgiveness. And Daddy said, he's over in the garage. He says, let me go talk to him to prepare him for what would be the shock of his life. And she and Daddy went over there, and Daddy went in first, and Arnold Jr. wanted to see her, so Daddy ushered her in. Mama said, when we left that day, they were still in there talking. And she said, and she came back the next week. And after that second visit, Arnold Jr. started cleaning up the place back here and brought in the furniture, set it up really nice, even set up in true Kirk fashion, a little bar for them back there. She said, they couldn't go out anywhere. They couldn't go to a hotel or a motel or out to eat. People would recognize them. So he set this up, and she would come once a week, every week, and spend the night. And that became a pattern. She said, Mama said, I've asked him, what is he going to do now that all this is going to be torn down? He said, well, I'm not giving her up, and we're going to continue to meet somewhere. We'll meet somewhere between here and where she lives in Virginia. And they did. I gathered that I was living in Atlanta, but they must have done that for a couple or 2 years. And Arnold Jr. developed, he started with a lump in his neck, and he developed lymphoma, a very aggressive form of cancer. And very quickly, in just a few weeks, he was hospitalized, and he died in just a few weeks. It seemed like a very short time. A couple of weeks or so after Arnold Jr. died, Ann called Mom and Daddy. They were at home now since the business was gone. She asked if she could come to Salisbury, and would they take her to Arnold Jr.'s grave, that she wanted to pay her respects and to say goodbye to Arnold Jr., and that she didn't want to go alone. She didn't know if she would run into family that might question it or anything. If Mom and Daddy were with her, they could keep anything like that from happening. And Mom and Daddy said yes, they would. So she came into town, and they took her to Arnold Jr.'s, to his grave spot. She said her goodbyes, and she left and went off, drove away to Virginia, and they never saw her again. And I don't know whether Etta Mae ever knew or found out. Oh, one time she did come once. It wasn't unusual for him to work at night, so he could kind of hide that he was gone at night. But one time she did come to the office looking for him, wanting to know where he was. Was he in the garage? Well, my father, thinking on his feet, said, oh, no. He went to the junkyards to see if he could find a part for one of the taxis to fix. So she left because the love nest was occupied that day. So now, when I go to a garage to get my car repaired and do all those things, I take a deep breath. I breathe in the fumes of paint and oil and rubber. And I think of love second chances, forgiveness, and the permanence of love. Thank you. Thank you. This last love story is a true story from the Chestnut Hill neighborhood I grew up in. It was a very stable neighborhood for the most part. People that lived there had lived there for decades. In the 40s and 50s, there was no real estate industry in Salisbury. Houses stayed in families. People didn't move. They did not move. Mary Ann, my best friend that lived across the street, she lived there with her mother and her grandmother and her brother and father. There were 3 generations in that house. Mary Ann's mother never lived in another house. She lived in that house. She was born in that house, and she lived in that house to the very, very near the end of her life. So that was common. It was a very stable neighborhood. And that stable neighborhood has led to some stable friendships. My best friend Dolores of 70-some years is here, as is Mary Ann. So it was a wonderful way to grow up. There was one source of instability in that neighborhood, though, and we had one rental house on the block, our block. And the people in the neighborhood didn't like having that rental house there because it was always people moving in and out. We couldn't seem to get anybody to stay a long time. They were always poor, and which wasn't bad, we were all poor, but they always had a lot of children, and their children ran all over the neighborhood and kind of ran wild. And they didn't keep up the place, so it was an eyesore. But when I was 12 years old and somewhere like that, Novella Flo and her 4 children moved into that house. Novella, it had been vacant for a while, but she moved into that house with her 4 children. She was a very young woman, probably 23 or 24 years old, and very pretty. She was a very pretty woman. She had a beautiful complexion. She was very slender. She wore her hair longer and kind of loosely curled like movie stars in the 40s did. And I knew that there was an interesting story here because the women in the neighborhood after she moved in, started talking and whispering and talking in code and things. And because, it was unusual. There was no husband. Her husband wasn't with her. But I kept hearing, I couldn't get anything. I could hear the word jail. I could hear the word gun. I could hear things like that. So I didn't know what happened, but I heard the word Texas. So I got the idea they had lived in Texas. Something bad had happened. And with her husband, I didn't know if he was in jail or what had happened, but she had moved to North Carolina. She had family in this block down below who had helped her find this rental house and get set up there. Her children ranged in age at that point from about 3 to about 8. Now, the women in our neighborhood, the older women especially, most of them didn't work, and they judged harshly. They were, and they were watching Novella to see whether Novella would be a good woman or a bad woman. And so they knew she'd be, signs of a bad woman were if she didn't keep a tidy house. That was number 1. She had to keep a clean house. Number 2, her children had to be in clean clothes, be clean, be well-mannered, and not run around wild all over the neighborhood. 3, if she was a good woman, she wouldn't be having any male visitors. And no alcohol, no beer cans in the yard, no thrown out bourbon bottles, nothing like that. All those were signs that, so they were watching, and they weren't going to accept Novella until they knew whether she was a good woman or she was a bad woman. But it didn't take very long for them to realize that she was a good woman. First, she kept an immaculate house. It was always clean, porch was always clean, nothing was lying around. Her children were always in clean clothes, well-mannered to the adults, pleasant children. And this house was a really old house. It was about 50 years old. It had never been painted, and so it was brown, burnished wood like you see on barns and sheds out in the country sometime. And it had a yard to match. It had a brown dirt yard. There wasn't a shrub. There wasn't any flowers. There was not a single blade of grass on that yard. It was a brown house with a brown dirt yard. But every dry day that we had, Novella Flo was out in her yard, sweeping her yard. And not only did she never have any male visitors, she didn't flirt with their husbands either. So that was good. And no alcohol. There was never any alcohol. So they decided Novella was a good woman, and they accepted her. So as a sign of their acceptance and respect for her, they took her, a pound cake and some food and gifts for the children. And thereafter, she was a member of our neighborhood and included in all those things like showers that you give for people who are going to get married and have babies and teas and things. And she was very poor. Novella was extremely poor. She did not work and had 4 children. So whenever they could, they helped her out by, if somebody needed somebody to help with spring cleaning, they would hire Novella. If they needed, somebody was sick and they needed a little extra help, they would hire her. They looked for opportunities that they could give her a chance to make some money and not have to leave her home. Well, across the street from Novella Flo lived Miss Bertha, who was the oldest woman in the neighborhood. She was so old, her hair was so white it looked bleached, and she'd gotten very frail, very seldom came out of the house now. And her son, Bobby, lived there with her. Bobby was already in his mid-40s, and he was really a loner. He didn't have any friends, didn't have any male friends that he went bowling with, didn't have any girlfriends, never dated. His life was working at the lumber yard where he worked, coming home, eating a quick dinner, going out to his large workshop in his backyard where he did woodworking and made furniture. And he made beautiful furniture. People bought it and prized it. It was prized because it was beautiful wood and he did such great work. So that was Bobby's life, the lumber yard, his mother, making furniture. And he was not very friendly at all to us kids. A lot of people would joke with us, say hey to us. He'd just drive on by, wouldn't say anything, just go into the house. And he had begun to get a little, look a little middle-aged looking, a little paunchy, he's getting a little bald-headed. And everybody, talked about Bobby as like he was a eunuch or something maybe. And he had no interest in women, so they thought he's a confirmed bachelor, a mama's boy is what they told him. Well, Miss Bertha had a really bad stroke. And back then, we didn't have rehab centers or anything like that, so after she got out of the hospital, she had to come home, but she couldn't resume her normal things that she did around the house. So Bobby asked Novella if he could hire her to watch Miss Bertha during the day, cook dinner for him at night, and then help get Miss Bertha in bed. Well, that was perfect for her. She could go back and forth between her house and his house, and she could, be there when her kids came home from school and all that kind of thing. I was already a junior in high school when this happened, and the kids were growing up too. So the older kids were now about to be in high school. So they didn't need quite as much care as they did before. So it worked out perfectly for her. And Bobby, they developed a routine. And we did notice though that Bobby must have liked her cooking, because when he came home, he would just bound up those steps, eager to get there. When we were young, we would play outside at night, and we played a game called Ain't No Bears Out Tonight, which was a kind of hide-and-go-seek game. And Marianne and my brother and I would play with other kids, and it was like we had one big backyard, because all the backyards just flowed one backyard to the other. There were no fences, no hedges. People didn't care if we played in their backyard, so we'd play in our backyard, Butcher's backyard, other people's backyards. The only backyard we couldn't play in was Bobby's, because they didn't want us, said, don't go near his workshop. He doesn't want any children around there. You could get hurt. Miss Butcher said you could cut your arm off. So we always had to stop short. But one night we were out there, and he was in his workshop. It was summer. It was just beginning to get dark. And we could see him bent over his work table. We could hear the radio coming out, and he was making something. So we were all curious, what could he be making? And we were debating the issue. My brother said, I bet he's making a hobby horse, a rocking horse, something I can play with. I said, no, I bet he's making a roller coaster for the city park. Big projects were in my mind. Mary Ann, my friend, the most practical of all three of us, said, "Oh, I bet he's making a casket for Miss Bertha." Well, at that point, we had to find out what Bobby was making. So we walked and got to the edge of the building and knelt down and crept along that building till we got to the window ledge. And just as we got to Bobby's window, we were going to started to stand up and peep in that window, and just then he looked up and saw us. And he came running out, hollering and screaming at us and saying ugly things to us, and we went running. And after that, we never spoke to him, didn't want to have anything to do with Bobby. I even asked my mother if something was wrong with him because of the way he acted. She said, "No, he's just shy. He doesn't know how to act around people, but he's got a good heart, and he's taking care of his mother. Not many men would do that." So she continued to take care of Miss Bertha, and everything began. The house looked better. Everything was better. I even noticed that he took her children into his workshop and showed them what he was doing. I thought, that's really weird. And one night I was out there when they all got in his car, and they said they were going to the drive-in. I said, "Mama, Bobby's taking them to the drive-in." "Oh, isn't that nice? That's wonderful." So after Miss Bertha died, Novella continued to keep house for Bobby and do things, because he did need the help and all. And the women didn't think anything of it. There was nothing amiss. Bobby was a confirmed bachelor, no interest in women. And they knew that Novella went to her home every night. But a few months after Miss Bertha died, they announced to the neighborhood that they were getting married. And they were very happy, and they said that they weren't going to move right away or get married right away, that Bobby wanted to build a house for them. And he'd bought some land just outside of town in the county, and he built them a house, and he even built most of the furniture for the house. And when the house was ready and everything, they got married in June of 1961 at Haven Lutheran Church, just a couple of blocks down from us. And it was the year we graduated high school. And after the wedding, they all moved out to their new house, the house that Bobby built. And I never saw them again. I had graduated high school, I went on to college, and we just didn't run into each other. Mama saw them around town occasionally. Bobby still worked at the lumber yard. And she would tell me that she'd run into them and things. One night, the Rowan County Fair was going on, and I'd already graduated college by now, and I was living in New York at the time, and Mama called me to tell me that she had been to the Rowan County Fair and had run into Bobby and Novella. And, after they married, their marriage flourished. Within a year, she had one child, and shortly thereafter, she had a second child. So they were there at the fair with their two younger children. The others were older. And Mama said she had never seen a happier couple, that they stopped and talked a while. They told her about their happiness, their house, their children, and they just talked. And Mama said the last she saw of them, Bobby had the youngest on his shoulders, and she was holding the hand of the other one. And they were heading off into the looking at the fireworks display for the night. And that was their love story. So, now to wrap this all up, I guess, the thing to observe here is that you never know when or where love is going on. I mean, it can be anywhere. It could be in a garage, in the back of a garage. You might have to sleuth out these love stories, and it might take a while. You might have to have some patience. It might take your whole life. Took a long time for me to figure out Miss Butcher's love story. But I guarantee you there are stories out there waiting to be sleuthed. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Bees do it, even edge educated fleas do it. Let's do it. Let's fall in